You don't notice it at first. It begins quietly. A subtle shift in how you move through your day. You stop reacting instantly. You stop feeling the need to explain every decision. You stop checking if people approve of what you're doing. And in that space, something starts to rebuild inside you. Because the truth is, most people don't lack discipline. They lack direction. And that confusion doesn't come from a lack of effort. It comes from too much noise, too many opinions, too many distractions, too many moments where you look outward before you look inward. And every time you do that, you lose a piece of yourself. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, quietly. You wake up one day and realize you've been living in reaction mode, responding to everything, building nothing, moving constantly, but not moving forward. And that's where this path separates. Because the moment you stop explaining, you start observing. The moment you stop reacting, you start thinking. The moment you stop performing, you start becoming. And that's the shift most people never make. They stay in motion, but they never gain control. Because control isn't about doing more. It's about doing less, but with intention. Think about it. How much of your day is actually yours? Not scheduled by others. Not influenced by notifications, not shaped by expectations, just yours. Very little. And that's the problem. Because without ownership of your time, you can't build ownership of your life. So you start small. You don't announce it. You don't explain it. You just begin. You wake up, and instead of reaching for your phone, you sit in silence. At first it feels uncomfortable, almost unnatural. Your mind starts racing. Thoughts you've been avoiding suddenly show up. Doubts, regrets, unfinished ideas, and the instinct is to escape, to distract, to go back to noise. But this time, you don't, you stay. And that's where the real work begins. Because silence isn't empty. It's revealing. It shows you where your attention has been wasted. It shows you what you've been avoiding. It shows you the gap between who you are and who you keep saying you want to become. And most people run from that, because it's easier to stay busy than to be honest. But if you stay long enough, something changes. The chaos slows down, the thoughts become clearer. And for the first time in a long time, you're not reacting, you're choosing. That's power, not loud, not visible, but real, because now when something triggers you, you don't jump, you pause, you think, you decide. And that space, that small gap between stimulus and response, that's where your entire life starts to change. Because in that gap, you're no longer controlled by habits, you're guided by awareness. And awareness leads to precision. Now your actions are cleaner, more intentional, less wasted movement. You stop arguing with people who don't matter. You stop explaining decisions that don't need approval. You stop chasing attention that doesn't build you, and suddenly you have energy again, not because life got easier, but because you stopped leaking it everywhere. You start focusing, not on everything, just on what matters. One task, one goal, one direction, and you commit to it fully. No multitasking, no constant switching, just deep, uninterrupted effort. And this is where most people fail, because deep work requires silence. It requires patience. It requires you to sit with discomfort without escaping. And most people aren't trained for that. They've trained themselves to react, not to focus. But you're different now. Because you've seen what distraction costs, you felt what scattered attention does to your progress, so you protect your focus. You guard it, like it's the most valuable thing you own. Because it is. And over time, that focus compounds. You start finishing what you start. You start building momentum. You start seeing real results. Not imagined progress, not temporary motivation. Actual movement forward. And here's where it gets interesting. You don't feel the need to talk about it, because you're too busy doing it. And that's silence. It changes how people see you. Not because you tried to impress them, but because your presence is different. You're calmer, more grounded, less reactive. And people notice. They don't always understand it, but they feel it, because there's something rare about someone who doesn't need attention, someone who doesn't chase validation, someone who just works quietly, consistently, without announcing it. That kind of person becomes dangerous, not to others, but to mediocrity, to excuses, to the old patterns that kept them stuck. And that's when the deeper shift happens. You stop identifying with your past habits. You stop seeing yourself as someone who tries. You become someone who does. And that identity, it's built through repetition, through showing up when it's hard, through choosing discipline over comfort, through staying silent when your ego wants to speak. And every time you do that, you reinforce something powerful: self-trust. Because now you know if you say you'll do something, you'll do it. No audience needed. No external pressure required. Just you and your word. And that's rare, because most people break promises to themselves daily. They say they'll start. They say they'll change. They say they'll commit. But when the moment comes, they hesitate. They delay. They escape. And over time, that destroys confidence. Not because they're incapable, but because they've trained themselves not to trust their own decisions. But you're reversing that, one action at a time, one salient decision at a time. You're becoming someone reliable, not to others, to yourself. And once you have that, everything changes. Because now you don't need motivation, you don't need hype, you don't need someone to push you. You move because it's who you are. And that's the highest level of discipline. Not forced, not temporary, but integrated. It becomes your default, your standard, your baseline. And from there, growth becomes inevitable. Not fast, not flashy, but steady and real. You start seeing opportunities others miss because your mind isn't cluttered. You make decisions faster because you're not overthinking every outcome. You adapt better because you're not emotionally attached to things going one specific way. And most importantly, you feel in control, not of everything, but of yourself. And that's enough, because when you control how you think, how you act, how you respond, you stop being a victim of circumstances. You become the one directing your life, quietly, deliberately, without needing permission. And here's the part most people don't realize. This path isn't lonely. It's just focused. You're not isolating yourself from the world. You're separating yourself from noise. You still connect. You still communicate. But now it's intentional. You speak when it matters. You listen more than you react. You choose quality over quantity. And your relationships improve because of it. Because people feel your presence, not your performance. They trust your words because you don't waste them. They respect your boundaries because you enforce them without apology. And all of this, it comes from one simple shift. Say less. Do more. Focus inward. Stay silent. Let your actions speak. Because at the end of the day, no one remembers what you said you would do. They remember what you actually did. And the person you're becoming right now, in silence, in discipline, in focus, that person doesn't need to prove anything. They just keep building, keep improving, keep moving forward. And one day, without warning, people will look at you and say, "You've changed." And you'll know the truth. You didn't change overnight. You changed in silence. You changed when no one was watching. You changed when it was hard. And that's why it lasts. You try to justify your path to someone who isn't walking it. You dilute your focus just a little bit more. And at first that doesn't seem like much. It feels harmless, even necessary, like you're just being clear or responsible. But over time, those small leaks of energy start to add up until one day you realize you're more tired from explaining your life than actually living it. And that's when something inside you begins to question everything. Why am I doing so much talking and so little moving? Why does it feel like I'm constantly proving instead of progressing? And that question, if you sit with it long enough, becomes a turning point because it forces you to see the difference between motion and noise, between real effort and performative effort, between building something and just appearing like you are. And once you see that difference clearly, it becomes almost impossible to go back to the old way of operating. You start noticing how often people speak without substance, how quickly they react without thinking, how easily they give away their attention to things that don't deserve it. And instead of judging them, you begin to understand them because you recognize that pattern. You've lived it yourself. You know what it feels like to be pulled in every direction, to chase approval, to confuse visibility with value, and that understanding creates a kind of quiet separation, not in an arrogant way, but in a grounded way. You simply stop participating in the noise, not because you think you're above it, but because you've realized it costs too much. There's a discipline in that kind of silence that most people never develop, because it requires something uncomfortable. It requires you to let go of being understood in every moment. It requires you to accept that not everyone will see your vision, not everyone will agree with your choices, not everyone will recognize your growth right away, and instead of trying to correct that, you let it be. You keep moving, you keep building, you keep refining yourself in ways that don't need immediate recognition. And that's where something powerful begins to form, not externally but internally, a kind of stability that isn't shaken by opinions, a kind of confidence that doesn't depend on applause. You start to notice that your mind feels different, less crowded, less reactive. There's more space between thoughts, more clarity in your decisions. You're not rushing to respond. You're not feeling the need to fill every silence with words. You become comfortable with pauses, with stillness, with not knowing everything immediately, and that comfort is what allows deeper thinking to emerge. Because when your mind isn't constantly interrupted, it starts to organize itself. It starts to prioritize what actually matters and filter out what doesn't. This is where your attention becomes intentional instead of automatic. You no longer give it away to every notification, every opinion, every distraction. You choose where it goes, and that choice alone changes everything, because attention is the foundation of your life. Whatever you consistently focus on expands, whatever you ignore fades, and when you direct your attention inward toward your habits, your thoughts, your actions, you begin to shape yourself with precision, instead of being shaped by everything around you. And with that precision comes a different kind of progress. It's not loud, it's not immediate, but it's real. You start finishing things, you start following through, you start building momentum that doesn't rely on motivation because it's rooted in consistency. And the more you experience that, the less you feel the need to talk about what you're doing, because the doing itself becomes enough. The progress becomes your proof. The discipline becomes your identity. There's a moment in this process where something shifts in your relationships as well. You begin to engage differently. You listen more, you speak less, but when you do speak, your words carry weight because they're not rushed, they're not reactive. They come from a place of thought and presence, and people notice that, not always consciously, but they feel it. They feel the difference between someone who is trying to impress and someone who is simply being, and that presence creates a kind of respect that doesn't need to be demanded. It happens naturally. You also start to notice how much unnecessary conflict disappears from your life, not because the world has changed, but because you have. You're no longer pulled into arguments that don't matter. You're no longer trying to win every conversation or prove every point. You understand that not every opinion requires a response, not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected, and that understanding saves you an incredible amount of energy that can now be invested in things that actually move your life forward. And as this becomes your default way of operating, you begin to experience something that's rare in today's world, a sense of control, not over everything, but over yourself, your reactions, your focus, your direction. You're no longer at the mercy of every external trigger. You're not constantly thrown off by what others say or do. You remain steady even when things around you are not. And that steadiness is what allows you to make better decisions, to act with clarity instead of impulse, to respond instead of react. This is the kind of control that doesn't come from force. It comes from understanding what is within your influence and what is not, understanding where your energy is best spent and where it is wasted, understanding that your peace is not something to be negotiated with the world, but something to be protected by your own choices. And the more you live this way, the more you realize how much of your previous stress was self-created, not intentionally, but through habits of thought and behavior that you never questioned before. Habits like over-explaining, like seeking constant validation, like reacting to everything instead of choosing your responses. And once those habits start to fall away, the weight you are carrying begins to lift, not because your life suddenly becomes easy, but because you're no longer adding unnecessary pressure to it. There's a simplicity in this way of living that can feel almost unfamiliar at first, because you spent so much time in complexity, in overthinking, in trying to manage everything at once. But simplicity doesn't mean doing less. It means doing what matters without distraction. It means focusing your energy on the few things that actually create impact and letting go of the rest. And that kind of focus is what creates real momentum, not the scattered effort of trying to do everything, but the deliberate effort of doing the right things consistently. And as that momentum builds, so does your confidence, but it's not the loud kind of confidence that needs to be seen. It's quiet. It's steady. It's based on evidence. You've kept promises to yourself. You've shown up when you said you would. You've done the work even when no one was watching, and that track record becomes your foundation. You don't need to convince yourself anymore. You know who you are because you've proven it to yourself through action. This is why silence becomes less of a strategy and more of a natural state. You're not forcing yourself to be quiet. You simply don't feel the need to speak as much because your energy is directed elsewhere, toward building, toward growing, toward becoming. And that shift changes how you experience your days. You're less drained, less scattered, more focused, more present. Time feels different because you're actually in it instead of constantly being pulled out of it by distractions and reactions. And in that presence you begin to notice opportunities you might have missed before. Ideas come more clearly. Solutions appear more naturally, not because you've become smarter overnight, but because your mind finally has the space to think without interruption. You're no longer drowning in noise. You're operating from clarity, and clarity is what allows you to move forward with confidence, even when the path isn't fully visible. There's also a deeper level to this that reveals itself over time, something that goes beyond productivity or focus. It's a sense of alignment, a feeling that your actions and your values are no longer in conflict. You're not saying one thing and doing another. You're not presenting a version of yourself that doesn't match your reality. You're living in a way that feels true, and the truth creates a kind of inner peace that external validation could never provide, because when you're aligned, you don't need constant reassurance. You don't need to check if you're on the right path every few minutes. You feel it in the way you move, in the way you simp in, where you respond to challenges. There's a steadiness there, a trust in yourself that comes from consistency. And that trust is what allows you to keep going, even when things are uncertain, even when results are slow, even when no one is watching. And that's the part most people never reach. Not because it's impossible, but because it requires patience. It requires you to continue without immediate reward, to keep building, without constant feedback, to trust the process when there's no external proof yet. And that's where silence becomes your greatest ally, because it removes the pressure to perform. It gives you the space to develop without interruption. It allows your growth to happen at a pace that is sustainable and real over time. This way of living compounds in ways that are hard to see in the beginning, but undeniable later. Your work improves your thinking, sharpens your presence, deepens, and people begin to notice, not because you told them to, but because the difference is evident in everything you do. And when that happens, you don't feel the need to explain it. You don't feel the urge to announce your transformation. You simply continue because you understand that the process never really ends. There's always another level of clarity, another layer of discipline, another version of yourself to grow into, and that realization keeps you grounded. It keeps you focused on what matters instead of getting distracted by temporary recognition or short-term validation. You're building something that lasts, not just externally, but internally. A way of being that remains steady regardless of circumstances, and that's what gives you an advantage that most people overlook. Not because it's hidden, but because it's quiet. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't announce itself. It simply works. So when you look at your life now and you feel that urge to explain, to justify, to react, pause for a moment and ask yourself, is this actually moving me forward, Or is it just noise? Is this action aligned with who I want to become? Or is it a habit I haven't questioned yet? And in that pause, you'll find your power, not in the reaction but in the choice, not in the words but in the restraint, not in the need to be seen, but in the ability to see yourself clearly, because at the end of the day, the person you're becoming isn't defined by what you say about yourself. It's defined by what you consistently do when no one is watching, and the more you align with that truth, the less you'll feel the need to explain anything at all. You'll simply live in a way that makes explanations unnecessary, and that's when everything changes, not suddenly, not dramatically, but deeply and permanently, because you're no longer chasing attention, you're building substance, you're no longer reacting to the world, you're directing your place. Within it, you're no longer scattered, you're focused, and in that focus, you find a kind of freedom that most people spend their entire lives searching for without ever realizing it was available to them all along.